Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next installment of our World Religions course. Um, as you can tell, we missed last week as well. I apologize because there was not too there was not too much availability for me because I was looking after my entire sick family. So you can probably still hear it from me anyway. I don't know if any of you guys have gotten it. I hope not, but so it's bad news. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit. I want to recap a little bit of what we talked about with Hinduism, and then talk about Buddhism. That's where, right now we're in the Dharmic religions, the Dharmic traditions. And so why don't we just dive in? So, probably the most important concepts for Hinduism, at least in terms of how we've looked at it, is Atman and Brahman. Now, Atman is this sort of the sort of the true self, if you want to call it that, right? It's the true self that is free of illusion. It's free of death. It's free of any kind of taint or anything like that. In fact, many schools of Hinduism would argue that Atman is one with Brahman. Okay, that Brahman is this all-pervading life force. Some think of it as an as like a sentient life force. Some think of it as just like a principle. In any case, there's this sense in Hinduism that what animates us deep inside is actual, like who we are deep inside, is actually somehow connected, even identical with this this force, this cosmic force of all reality. And of course, jiva, or illusion, we're under this section, this sense that you know that the life we live here and now, this life of the senses, the life of um, work and play and householding and everything else, that this is real. And according to Hinduism, that really is just an illusion that keeps us from, uh, it keeps us caught in the samsaric cycle. Okay, now the I'll talk more about samsara in a second. We talked about it last week as well. Samsara, of course, is the twirling wheel of birth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death. Um, and according to all of the Dharmic traditions, the um, the goal of religion is to somehow get us out of this samsaric um, problem that we're in again and again. Again, this goes past, back past all of of our lives here and now. Back, we are reaping the benefits now of lives that were lived many, many, who knows how long ago. Anyway, so uh, for Hinduism, one of the certainly the most we're talking about the Vedas as the sort of foundational texts of Hinduism, but one of the most famous of the Bhagavad of the Hindu scriptures is the Bhagavad Gita, which of course is a really small section in a much larger work called the Mahabharata. It tells the story of Arjuna, um, who is, if you'll remember from last week, he's the warrior, the Pandava warrior, who is, he's hesitating because he's at the cusp of a battle against many of his friends, his former friends, his family, and he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to kill people that he knows and loves and has a history with. And of course, Krishna teaches him that this is his duty, his dharma. And what Krishna teaches are three ways to liberation. One is the way of selfless action, right? So not being connected to the actions. We act in the world, but we're not connected to those actions as though their outcome matters. There's the way of knowledge. Okay, and there's also the way of devotion. So, devotion to a particular deity or manifestation of Brahman, like Shiva or Vishnu or Dev. Uh, we also saw that in Hinduism, one of the central issues of Hinduism is this question of caste, that every human has its place in the system. Um, and we talked a little bit about some of those devotional deities like Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma. So anyway, these are just things to keep in mind from last week. And as I mentioned, Hinduism and Buddhism are both Dharmic traditions. And this little sort of Venn diagram here gives you a sense of some of the differences and some of the commonalities between the two traditions. Now, um, you know, I'm gonna, I'm gonna unpack some of this. You know, I, I, I didn't make this Venn diagram. I wish I knew how, or I would have, but I kind of pilfered this from the internet. So there's stuff that I really like about this diagram. There's stuff that I don't. Um, But generally speaking, if you look through the middle, like the middle where the two circles meet, it's fairly straightforward. They both originate from the Indian subcontinent. They both uh, they have an end goal of enlightenment. They think of that generally as different, what enlightenment means, but still the goal is enlightenment, nirvana or moksha, right? Depending on which tradition you're talking about. Uh, they both believe in the concept of rebirth or reincarnation, as we think of it in the West, and they both have a sense of karma and dharma. Now, karma is they share this idea of karma as this cosmic law of cause and effect. So just as if I throw a ball up into the air, it will come down in the moral sphere, um, which is connected to the physical sphere and the spiritual sphere. um, if I make an action, everything is an action, even my emotions, my thoughts. If I make an action, it's going to have consequences. And so uh, for both of these traditions, dharma is actually in some ways a way to help us alleviate the outcome of karma, right? So karma is the thing that keeps us, not only does it affect us in our lives, but it's also the thing that keeps in many ways pulling us back into lives through rebirth. Whereas dharma is this principle. They both have so Buddhism and Hinduism both have a concept of dharma, although that concept is different. So for Buddha, what the dharma means is different. So for Hinduism, dharma is sort of like your life duty. Like think of it as duty, um, or law or duty, like your um, expectations of you, right? Whereas dharma for Buddhism is means the teachings, right? The teaching of the Buddha is the Dharma. Okay, and the Dharma, if understood correctly and practiced for Buddhists, will eventually alleviate us from the cycle of samsara. So, when you're talking about dharmic traditions like Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism, what you're talking about really is the questions that revolve around the self. What is the self? Is the self what is it that's looking out from behind your eyes right now? What is that thing, if it is something at all, right? Is it a thing in time, or is it one thing, or are there many selves that we have? Or as Daniel Dennett, famous philosopher of our day, might argue, is the self just sort of a narrative, an ongoing, constantly constructed narrative of our past lives, right? Of our life as it has gone in the past. You can decide what you think about that, but it certainly is worth thinking about whether you're interested in Buddhism or Hinduism or anything else or not. Who are you? Um, Anyway, speaking of Buddhism, Buddhism is the oldest missionary religion on earth. The Buddha, of course, is the uh, originator of this tradition, at least in its current form. Uh, it's a quote from the Buddha, everything that arises also passes away. So strive for what has not arisen. If we hold on to things that pass away, then we will sink when they sink. Okay. But if we strive for things that are eternal or that haven't arisen at all, then that will be forever. So There are three major forms of Buddhism. Theravada, I'm going to explain all of these. So Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. Okay. But before I get into those, I want to talk about the general ideas behind Buddhism. So Buddhism, as I mentioned before, it shares many of its concepts with Hinduism. You could argue that I mean, many doctrinaire Buddhists might disagree with this, but you could think of Buddhism as almost a reformation within Hinduism in India in you know several centuries before the Common Era. Okay, so Buddhism in many ways is in some ways it's a form of Hinduism. You could argue. Okay. Now, I don't want to confuse you because most Buddhists would say it's a separate tradition. In fact, most Hindus would argue it's a separate tradition, but the similarities are real. Okay. So Buddhism argues that universes rise and pass away. Our universe also moves through time. Yes, there are gods and spirits, possibly, but they're also caught in the sweep of time. The law of karma causes all living creatures to be reborn again and again. So, whenever morality and truth have declined significantly in any universe, a Buddha arises in that era and, as they say, sets the Dharma or teaching wheel in motion. So Buddha comes along, sets the wheel in motion, and then it spins until it gets slower and slower, and then another Buddha comes along and spins it. Okay, so this is that kind of idea of the Dharma being constantly taught. Um, so in Buddhism, they refer to three gems or refuges. Okay, in which Buddhists can take safety and solace. One is in the face of this samsara, in the face of this ongoing pain and suffering. And these three refuges or three gems are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Now, the Sangha is the community of monks and nuns. Okay, so the ordained community of Buddhists. Okay, um, so let's talk about each of these gems in turn. So the first gem is the Buddha. At the beginning of this term, I sort of told you the rambling story of the Buddha Shakyamuni, or the sage of the Shakya clan, who the person we think of as the Buddha, most of us, when we are thinking of the Buddha, thinking of Buddhism, that's Shakyamuni Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama. There have been others, and there will be other Buddhas in the future. So Maitreya Buddha is supposed to be the next one. Um, eh, but the Buddha, traditionally in Buddhism, the Buddha is not considered to be a god or an incarnation of any kind of divine being, but a mortal person. Okay, and this is one of the I guess one of the gravitational pulls of Buddhism for many people is that Buddhism at its core is something that's available for humans. Okay, we don't have to necessarily rely on something else, some transhuman being per se. We have to, the Buddha was a guy. Okay, and all of us can be Buddhas in theory. Okay, or at least can be liberated. So I'll briefly go through the Buddha's earthly life. He lived between the 5th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. According to the stories, he achieves enlightenment through his own power. Of course, this is through hundreds, if not thousands, of lives of spiritual striving, in as he was what's called a bodhisattva, or uh, uh, basically somebody on the road to Buddhahood. Okay, and of course, um, the role of karma here is that as as the entity that winds up becoming Gautama Buddha, the Buddha we're talking about, as he goes through his lives, he keeps building up more and more good karma. And that good karma translates into the next life where he can build up more and more and more and more and more and more until the life where he is the Buddha for this age. And then, of course, after that, he passes into parinirvana. We'll talk about that later. Um, there's a story. Uh, there's a story about a previous Buddha, many thousands of lifetimes ago. Not this Buddha, but a different Buddha, who was walking into a village in the rain. It was during the rainy season, and uh, it was very muddy in that village. A lot of mud, dusty roads, and so that in the rain, those roads turned to mud. And so the Buddha was walking down the road and he came to a huge puddle, and there's a young boy there who took his cloak, his jacket, and laid it over the puddle so that that Buddha could walk over it. And that Buddha turned to that boy and said, "One day you are going to be the Buddha." And sure enough, that was according to tradition, that's the same entity that became the Buddha eventually, many thousands of lives later. Um, but there are, according to some traditions of Buddhism, and there are several, there are, several miraculous events surrounding Buddha's life. His mother Maya could see him in the womb. It's said that he took 7 steps when he was born, as soon as he was born. Um, there's this same idea of immaculate or asexual conception, which we see in other traditions. So there's the dream in which a white elephant enters Maya's uh, uh, womb, and that becomes the embryo of the Buddha. Anyway, I told this story before that the Buddha's father, before he was the Buddha, or it was known as the Buddha, uh, was asked, do you want your son to be a prince or a priest? And of course, the father wanted the prince, but then the Buddha goes out one day and sees those 4 sights. He sees a sick man, an old man, a dead man, sorry, and a monk, wandering ascetic whose calmness and detachment really impresses the prince. And so that very night, he chooses the path of the monk, not the priest so much as the monk. Um, and so he, runs into the forest. He says goodbye to his family, and he goes into the forest, and for several years, for almost a decade, he takes on the life of a wandering ascetic. He renounces many things. He focuses on concentration, yoga, he fasts for 7 years. At one point, it's suggested that he survives on only a few grains of rice each day, um, and he's almost dead. But then there's the fateful night when he sits under the Bodhi tree, and vows to become enlightened or to die. And Mara, the Lord of Death, comes to tempt him because Mara realizes, hey, I'm about to this guy's about to achieve nirvana. He's about to become enlightened. I don't want that. So he sends his daughters in, these are very thinly veiled metaphors for greed, boredom, desire. Next, Mara offers him any worldly wish if only he'll renounce his current vow, that is to sit under the Bodhi tree and become enlightened or die. Next, Mara sends his sons, Fear and Anger, and Mara is bested, right? All the Buddha just touches the ground and the earth trembles, and all of Mara's forces, all of his temptations are just swept away. And, after a night of meditation, the Buddha's past lives open up to him and he achieves enlightenment. He becomes the Buddha. And Mara, actually, in the story, eventually returns and begs him not to teach. He says, no one's going to understand. No one's going to want to hear this. No one's going to be able to, it's just going to actually make people sad because they won't be able to achieve what you've achieved. And the Buddha says, kind of get lost, like, get out of here. So, enlightenment, what's it like? For weeks, the Buddha is caught up in nirvanic splendor. It's rapture. And from there, he goes to his old companions who were ascetic wanderers with him, and he converts them at the deer park in Sarnath in northern India. And he spends the next 40 years traveling and teaching and building his community. And when he dies, he enters parinirvana, or final, or fullest nirvana. Buddhism doesn't like to comment on nirvana, what it's like. It's often referred to as emptiness or nothingness, but that doesn't quite explain exactly what it is. It's pure bliss, but but how that would look as non-being. Okay, so the Buddha achieves enlightenment, so he becomes the first refuge of Buddhists from the wheel of samsara. Then the second gem is the Dharma. Now, the Dharma is the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha teaches. Okay, so the Dharma is teaching, not duty as it is in Hinduism. It's teaching in Buddhism. So you have the Four Noble Truths. The first is that suffering is inevitable for living beings. Now, it's not the Buddha isn't saying that everything is suffering. What he's saying is that, in fact, even suffering isn't the right necessarily the right translation of that word, dukkha. Dukkha really means more like unsatisfactory. Okay, um, because even when we're at our height of bliss, even when we're in ecstatic, whatever, there's still that sense that it's going to end, right? So even within the highest sort of concentration of gold, there's still dross there. So he's not saying that every moment is suffering, but that suffering is inevitable or unsatisfactoriness is inevitable for all living beings, not just for humans, for animals, for gods, for demons, all of them. Okay? Now, suffering arises, the second noble truth says, from desire or craving, attachment. So attachment in the truest sense that the things that we crave, the things that we want. Um, and this doesn't always have to be bad things. Okay, we can be attached to our family. We can be attached to our to wanting to desire to do good in the world, but suffering arises from those things. Okay, um, right? Think of family. We're of course we're attached. We love our family members, but they're I hate to say this, don't want to ruin your day, but they're all going to die, just like we're all going to die. Okay, so um, suffering and is arises from desire, from craving, from attachment. Now, the third noble truth is that it's possible to end suffering totally if desires cease. So if we can get rid of our desires or purge our desires, then our unsatisfactoriness will cease to affect us. And that we do that through the truth of the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is right view, right thought, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. Now, of course, we could write a book. We could seriously talk for a year about each one of these things up there. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that. So I want to move on. This is the Dharma, right? In its nutshell. According to Buddhism, existence has three characteristics. Okay, suffering or unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, and no soul or anatman. Okay, so suffering we talked about. Impermanence is the fact that everything is passing. Like look around. I mean, everything, even the cells that make up our bodies, the atoms that make up the molecules that make up the cells that make up our bodies, are constantly in motion. Nothing is ever resting. And unlike Western and some other Eastern philosophies, what's permanent is not what is valued most in Buddhism. Okay? For Buddhism, change is not a problem, it's a fact. Okay? Change is a fact of existence. Okay, um, it's not just that it happens; it is existence. Okay, and finally, there's on a more specific level, there is this idea of anatman. You might recognize the last part of that word, atman, right? Anatman just means no soul. This is the idea that um, the impermanence of humans as well as everything else. So, whereas the Upanishads suggested that Atman is eternal soul, the Buddha suggests that there is no unchanging self that exists at all. We'll come back to that because here's where a lot of people who aren't Buddhists kind of stumble because they would say, well, what is it that passes from life to life to life to life then? And what many Buddhists would say is that um, you think of it as akin to a candle with a flame on it. Okay. The flame is there. And then you take the flame and light another candle with that flame and then blow that flame out. And then you do the same with candle after candle. Now, you could argue in some senses it's the same flame. Yes, and it's still buffeted by the same winds. It still operates according to the same laws of physics, but it's in many ways it's a totally different flame. It's on a different candle. It's on a different right? So the flame and the goal is to have the flame go out and stay out. Okay? It's not to keep it going. The goal is to have that flame. That flame is the thing that burns. Okay? Anyway, take it or leave it. I mean, that's the idea. This leads us to the third gem, the Sangha. This is the community of ordained men and women in Buddhism. According to Buddhists, the the becoming a member of the Sangha is the most effective way to guard against the corrosive effects of the world. Like, okay, first of all, they took vows of chastity, obedience, poverty. Okay, but think about it this way. If you're trying to live this life of right thought, right meditation, right purity, right, if you're surrounded by a culture or cultures that don't value those things, how easy is it to not keep your vows, right? So that's why if you live together with the community that agrees on those vows, then it's a lot easier to, with a shared sense of purpose, it's a lot easier to live those ideals out. In the Sangha, each novice is assigned a teacher who's both demanding and loving and also a spiritual advisor. Monks and nuns are ordained and they're both engaged in the world in preaching the Dharma and spreading the Dharma and doing good deeds. But they're also engaged in spiritual seeking. So often a monk will spend several months in retreat. Pardon me, will spend several months in spiritual retreat, meditating for up to 10 or 12 hours a day, trying to achieve enlightenment. So, uh, it's interesting that Buddhism, as I hope I've indicated, arose in India, uh, and even though it's relatively small, I mean, in many ways, it's kind of disappeared. It's been reabsorbed back into Indian society, back into Hinduism in our own day. There are still some Buddhists, but in a relative sense, it's gone. But uh, Buddhism became very, 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 very prominent in India, especially during the Maurya dynasty. Um, that arose with King Ashoka. Those are his dates. Buddhism gained converts throughout all classes of Indian society, and I should say that one of the reasons why Buddhism gained converts is that the Buddha came out very strongly against the caste system, which we talked about, in which in the Hindu Dharma, there's this idea that the Dharma is part of Dharma. Your Dharma is your duty as a member of a particular caste. So the priests, the kshatriyas or the warriors, the merchant class, whatever. Okay, so in Hinduism, your caste determines your fate in this life, right? Whereas Buddhism would say, no, caste is a completely made up thing. So, of course, this garnered a lot of people throughout Indian society, some from the upper classes. The Buddha himself was of the Kshatriya clan, or Kshatriya clan, of the Kshatriya caste. But yeah, so he said no, but many of them were from the lower castes and the untouchables. Um, but King Ashoka, when he became a Buddhist, began a series of wars to expand his territory to the south and west, and eventually he wound up ruling a vast empire that included most of modern India. You can see it in the image on the left there. As a result of his reflection on the suffering caused by war, he was converted to Buddhism then, and he began promoting the ethic of ahimsa or nonviolence. Now, this is something that Buddhists and most Hindus take very, very, you know, uh, uh, take very, very close to their hearts, which is ahimsa. This idea that part of living a good life is living a life free of inflicting violence on others, not just on other humans, but on nature, on the creatures of the earth, the birds, right? So many, in fact, most Dharmic tradition followers that you come across are not meat eaters. They're strict vegetarians. Anyway, so um, I talked about the three gems or the three refuges. Now I want to talk a little bit about what are often referred to as the three vehicles or the three yanas. There's Theravada, or the school of the ancient ones. There's Mahayana, which is known as the great vehicle or large vehicle, and then there's the Vajrayana, known as the diamond vehicle. Okay, so each of these arises later in time. So I'm going to talk about Theravada first, and then we'll talk about Mahayana, and then we'll talk about Vajrayana. So today, what you find is Theravada Buddhism is the most prominent in places like Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam to some degree. Um, of the 18 divisions of early Buddhism, only one has come down to the present era, and that's Theravada, which means way of the elders. So this school was already widespread by King Ashoka's day during the 3rd century BCE. It was a conservative tradition, and it still considers itself to be preserving Buddhism in its original form. We'll see how it differs from Mahayana and Vajrayana later on. Um, but one thing that Theravada does is that it refuses to deify the Buddha. So other forms of Buddhism have said that there are, Buddhas are like gods. Um, but Theravada says no. The Buddha is a man, just like the rest of, or like is a human, just like the rest of us. So there's nothing intrinsically special about him, even though he was the greatest man in some ways because he achieved that. Anyway, so also Theravada tends to make distinctions between monastic and lay, very strict distinctions between those who are uh, members of the Sangha and those who are not members of the Sangha. And of course, salvation and release for Theravadins from samsara is due to one's own effort. So if you want out, you got to try. Okay, it's up to you. There's nobody out there that's going to save you. There's no God or even Buddha himself that can hear you or help you. It's up to you, to each of us, to save ourselves from this ongoing constant cycle of birth and rebirth. So, fast forward until about the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, maybe a little bit earlier than that. We have the arising of Mahayana Buddhism. So we're not entirely sure about the precise early history of Mahayana, but we do know that by the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, there were Buddhist ordination lineages or monk and nun lineages that distinguished themselves from earlier forms of Buddhism. And they called this form Mahayana or Great Vehicle of Dharma. So, so in contrast to older forms, uh, such as Theravada. So, what Mahayana Buddhism said is that you don't need to be a monk or a nun. You don't need to be a card-carrying member of the Sangha to actually achieve enlightenment. There's a very important role for the laity. Um, Also important for Mahayana is the concept of bodhisattvas. So, in Theravada Buddhism, so the other form of Buddhism, the other vehicle I was talking about, you have this concept of an arhat or a saint who looks to his own release. Remember, you're in charge of your own release from samsara. You're in charge of your own search for enlightenment. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's this concept of a bodhisattva. Now, bodhisattvas are elevated spiritual beings that have attained exalted states of consciousness, and they're mere steps from paranirvana themselves. They've taken what's called the bodhisattva vow to forego nirvana, entering into emptiness, until all entities are released. So they share their merit with other beings. So, advanced bodhisattvas, according to tradition, have been reborn into heavenly realms, and they're often revered and venerated and prayed to. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but like the concept of bodhisattvas is sort of pan Buddhist. So, Theravada, so think about it this way: the Buddha, before he became the Buddha, was a bodhisattva. Okay, so think about it that way. So it's not like Theravadan Buddhists would say there's no such thing as bodhisattvas. The innovation of Mahayana is that it says, okay, um, the goal is not as bodhisattvas to attain enlightenment for just ourselves. It's also to help all other sentient beings, humans, you know, like animals, gods, all of them to attain enlightenment eventually. So I want to again just point out here pardon me, what the differences are between Mahayana and Theravada. Theravada Buddhism maintains a strong focus on the Buddha of the present historical age. And in Theravada, the Buddha is not able to help us. The Buddha's he's gone, so we don't pray to the Buddha. Um, the Theravada is traditionally hesitant to speculate about transhuman powers and realities, um, like gods and whatever else. If there are gods, they're just caught up in samsara as well. And Theravada stresses the role of disciplined sangha as a necessary condition for liberation. So, pardon the typo for sangha, but in any case, you know, Theravada would say you really, really do need to become. You need to renounce the world if you're going to become enlightened, right? Have any chance of it. Mahayana says that's why they call it the big vehicle of Dharma, because in some ways, it's like whereas Theravada is like a, a kayak over the river of samsara, Mahayana is an ocean liner, right? There's much more room, right? So there are countless bodhisattvas that you can call on for help, such as Maitreya, um, uh, that is the next Buddha. One can achieve great merit, perhaps even enlightenment, while not a member of the Sangha. So again, these are just things I want you to keep in mind. Um, there are big differences between Mahayana and Theravada. You will be asked this on a test, for example, and it's also important just to understand that these are sort of different denominations within. I mean, maybe not different denominations within Buddhism. Now, the third denomination or vehicle of the Dharma is what's often referred to as Vajrayana Buddhism. Now, this is confusing as well for some people because many scholars, up until very recently, thought of Vajrayana as a subset of Mahayana, what we just talked about. But many people think today that Vajrayana is separate. So, Vajrayana Buddhism is much more um, uh, what am I trying to say? It's much more concentrated in places like Tibet, Mongolia. Okay, there's also a very large uh, sort of Western community of Vajrayana Buddhists. Um, but in the region of the Himalayan mountains, Vajrayana eventually became the majority religion. In the course of time, it came to dominate Nepal and Bhutan, Tibet, and Mongolia. Now, the name Vajrayana means diamond or thunderbolt vehicle. And the idea here is that this way is hard, unbreakable, unsplittable. And what it does is it symbolizes enlightenment, which is itself unbreakable, but which is capable of shattering spiritual obstacles. So Vajrayana in Tibet. So here's the thing: in Tibet, um, because travel to the high Himalayas was so difficult, it wasn't until about the 8th century of the Common Era, so like the 700s, that Buddhist missionaries and texts found their way up to Tibet, and so in any kind of systematic way. And pardon me, the indigenous religion that existed before Buddhism arrived was called Bon, which means truth or reality. And this tradition was interested in the safe passage of the soul of a dead person to existence in a land beyond death. And to get there, the Bon priests sacrificed horses and sheep and yaks, depending on the ritual. In any case, Bon appears to have interacted and combined to syncretized with Buddhism in Tibet, and elements of it have continued to the present day. For example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. If you haven't read it, I suggest that you do. It talks all about how um, you know the afterlife, the journey of the soul or that flame, the isness of a person from one life through the bardos or levels into another life. Okay. Anyway, uh, so this very short, brief sort of thing, this small map gives you a sense of like where Buddhism originated from. Of course, it originated in India, went all the way up into Nepal, found its way down south in Sri Lanka, down into um, places like uh, Vietnam, Thailand, over into China, eventually into Japan, Korea and Japan by the 6th century of the Common Era. And as it went, it transformed each of these places. Okay. Um, When we talk next week or the week after about Confucianism and Taoism, uh, uh, traditional Chinese religions or East Asian traditions, we're going to see that this interplay between this interplay between especially in China between traditions like Confucianism, which really emphasize you know being in this world, how we act in this world, and Buddhism, which kind of in many ways has an anti-social flavor to it in some ways. Anyway, the interaction of these traditions is very important. So we're actually going to stop that. We're not going to talk about the spread of Buddhism through China right now, which is its own kind of lecture in its own right. Um, but I do want to fast forward to Buddhism today. Buddhism is very prevalent in many places. Buddhism is very common in the West. Um, if you live in a town with other people not far, I guarantee you some of them are at least nominally Buddhist. Um, for Westerners, though, Buddhism was initially very difficult to understand. Was it a religion or not? Did it have a conception of God? Um, and knowledge of Buddhism in Europe and North America was almost non-existent before the mid 19th century. First-hand accounts of Buddhist meditational practice weren't available in the Western languages until the beginning of the 20th century, so not that long ago. But by the 1930s, around the middle of the last century, Buddhist societies had been established in Britain, France, and Germany. And of course, Buddhism is still strong in North America. It slowly gained converts through the 20th century among those who were disillusioned by many of the monotheistic approaches. Often, many people who are drawn to Buddhism are people who are, you know, uh, uh, people who are refugees from other traditions, namely the monotheistic approaches. Um, so existing alongside these new converts were Chinese, Japanese, Korean Buddhist populations that immigrated to North America in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, these tended to be concentrated in British Columbia, Hawaii, California, to some degree in Toronto as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Buddhism in North America. So, while outsiders are usually welcome among ethnic Buddhist congregations in North America, the languages spoken and the exotic look of the altars and furnishings often turn Westerners away. On the other hand, Buddhist meditation centers have been very successful in attracting large numbers of Western converts. In fact, many Western Buddhist practitioners wouldn't even call themselves Buddhists per se, um, even though they're they've been very much influenced uh, by Buddhist practices. So there's also a large number of secular Buddhists who would say, they're not attracted at all to this idea of, bodhisattvas or anything like that, or even, you know, even enlightenment in the sort of nirvanic sense, or even rebirth, but who say that Buddhism has a special message, spiritual message for today, or at least in its basics it does. I think of people like Sam Harris or Stephen Batchelor, others like there's a lot of people who who are attracted to the practice of Buddhism, right? Particularly the meditation practice for its sort of spiritual benefits. Several Buddhist umbrella organizations, like the Buddhist Council of Canada, are helping to bring Western meditation Buddhists into closer contact with ethnic Buddhists. So there's also a huge Buddhist influence on Western self-help, nonviolence, and anti-war movements. Okay, like you can't pick up a self-help book today or go to therapy today without usually coming into contact with sort of, some sort of vaguely Buddhist concepts. Okay. I know it's a big generalization, but so what are the prospects of the future for Buddhism? Well, according to Buddhist cosmology, we're presently in decline. So a new Buddha will appear at some point, the Buddha Maitreya, and will set in motion the wheel of Dharma again. So we don't know when Maitreya will appear. Buddhists think of the institutional aspects of their religion as inherently transitory and diminishing. So most Buddhists you talk to don't really care how many Buddhists there are or whether, I mean, not that they don't care, maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. Um, that's to be expected, right? Everything that rises passes away, remember? The key is not to get tied into those things, not to attach ourselves to those things. However, some aspects of Buddhism bring specific ideas to bear on modern problems. So, for example, one of the great ills of modern Western society is materialism and its corollary, modern stress. An increasing number of retreat centers, not just Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, others as well, focus on things like breathing techniques and meditational posture, insight into Dharma truths about attachment and letting go, calmness. Many emphasize the teachings of Anatman, overcoming the bonds of ego attachment and self-centeredness. Um, Many Buddhists call for schemes of economic development that are alternative to this kind of, you know, big fish takes all. Often it calls for a middle path between the environmental and social disasters of overdevelopment on the one hand and poverty on the other hand. So anyway, Buddhism as a tradition, um, is widespread, and to some degree, it's growing. Okay, but how that growth looks like is really, really, what it's going to look like in future generations, as time goes on, is hard to tell. But one thing we can say is that Buddhism often does attract, um, from its Western converts, people who tend to be in the, so relatively higher socioeconomic classes. So that might say something for its future. Anyway, um, of course, the most famous Buddhist is the 14th Dalai Lama, who I'm sure you've heard about. Buddhism has met these challenges of stress and the challenges of materialism fairly well. It's not losing large parts of its following to the other two missionary religions, that is, Islam and Christianity. It's still meaningful for people. You think about the teachings, whether you're a Buddhist or not, I mean, the idea of non-attachment and the passing away of things is actually, whether you're Buddhist or not, that's actually pretty insightful. It's actually a really helpful idea. Um, in all likelihood, if I look into my crystal ball, Buddhism will likely continue to be respected as the highest expression of spiritual wisdom for many centuries to come by many people. But as per Buddhist cosmology, in the distant future, when the wheel of Dharma set in motion by Shakyamuni or the Buddha stops turning, the next Buddha, Buddha Maitreya, will appear on the earth and turn the Dharma wheel yet again for the benefit of the next era. So that's a quick that's a quick foray into Buddhism. I hope you found it instructive, and I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks.